The rain had no business falling that hard in October, but nobody had told the sky. It had started sometime around 9 in the evening as a reasonable drizzle, the kind of autumn rain that smelled like wet leaves and cold earth and didn't particularly demand anything of anyone. By 10, it had made its intentions clear. By 11, it was coming down in sheets, hammering the corrugated roof of the iron-hold construction yard's equipment shed in a sustained roar that Marcus Webb could hear even from inside the foreman's house, even with the windows shut, even over the low murmur of the radio on the kitchen counter that he kept on more for company than for content. Marcus Webb was still awake at midnight. He usually was. He sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago and a set of procurement invoices spread out in front of him that he was only nominally reading. The numbers were fine. They were always fine or close enough to find that the difference could be managed, and managing the difference was what he did. He had a red pen in his hand, and he had made exactly 3 marks on the top page in the last 40 minutes. The rest of the time he had been looking at the rain streaking down the kitchen window, watching the orange glow of the yard's perimeter lights turn the falling water into something almost amber. He was a big man. Not in the inflated, carefully cultivated way of someone who spent serious time in a gym, but in the settled, structural way of a man who had been doing physical work since he was 16 years old, and whose body had simply become the sum of all of it. Broad-shouldered, thick through the chest, with hands that had the particular quality of old tools, scarred, reliable, permanently stained in the creases with something that no amount of washing had ever entirely removed. His face was weathered in the way of men who spent most of their working lives outside. The lines around his eyes were deep. His hair, once black, had gone iron gray at the temples and was making a steady push for the rest of his head, and he had reached the age where he found he didn't particularly mind. He had been the site foreman at Ironhold for 11 years. Before that, he had worked up through the ranks of 3 other construction outfits over a combined span of 12 years, starting as a laborer fresh out of high school with no particular plan and a strong back, and discovering, somewhere along the way, that he had a gift for the work that went beyond the physical. He could read a site the way other men read weather. He knew, often before the engineers did, where the problems were going to come from. He knew how to move a crew, not just how to direct them, but how to read the temperature of 20 different personalities at once, and keep the whole thing moving forward without anyone grinding against anyone else badly enough to cause damage. He had managed crews of humans, dwarves, and the occasional troll for 23 years. He had hired a gnomish structural specialist once, a deeply serious woman named Hedda who was 4'2", and could calculate load tolerances in her head faster than Marcus could find his calculator, and who had stayed with Ironhold for 6 years before being poached by a firm in the capital that offered her twice the salary and a research budget. He had worked alongside a half-orc project manager on a commercial contract 3 years back, who was the best logistical mind he had ever encountered on a job site. He had navigated labor disputes, material shortages, a freak ice storm in March that had set them back 6 weeks on a hospital expansion, and one memorable incident involving a cursed survey stake, and 3 days of increasingly baffling structural anomalies that had resolved itself when Denise in the office quietly removed the stake from where it had been accidentally incorporated into the foundation formwork and threw it into the river. 23 years. He thought, not arrogantly but with the simple confidence of accumulated experience, that he had seen everything the world could produce. Then something knocked on his door. He almost didn't hear it over the rain. He might not have if the radio hadn't chosen that particular moment to slip into the quiet stretch between songs. The knock was soft. Not a polite knock, there was a kind of considered politeness in a polite knock, a deliberate social performance, not an aggressive one either. It was hesitant. 3 soft, uncertain taps, evenly spaced, like whoever was on the other side had thought very carefully about the act of knocking and had then done it with the tentative precision of someone who wasn't entirely sure they had the right address, or the right to be there at all. Marcus set down his red pen. He looked at the door for a moment. It was midnight. It was raining with genuine violence. Nobody from the crew would knock like that. They'd pound, or they'd call his cell first. The yard's perimeter gate was locked, but it wasn't a complicated lock, and the fence itself was chain link, practical rather than serious. He got up from the table. He wasn't a man who moved particularly fast. but he moved with the unhurried certainty of someone who didn't waste motion. He crossed the kitchen, went through the narrow hallway with its coat hooks and its framed site map of the Kellner Bridge project from 2019 that he'd put up there and never taken down, and he opened the front door. The light from the hallway fell out into the rain and immediately got lost in it. She was enormous, even hunched the way she was, and she was hunched, deliberately, visibly working to compress herself, to pull her edges in and make the sheer fact of her size less immediately overwhelming. The dragon easily cleared 8 feet. Her shoulders, folded forward and inward, were still wider than the door frame by a significant margin. She stood on the small concrete stoop that had been built for a human-scale visitor, and it held her, but only just, and Marcus had a brief professional assessment of the load capacity before his attention moved on. Her scales, in the harsh orange spill of the yard lights through the rain, were almost black. But the color underneath wasn't a true black. There was depth to it, a richness, and in the places where the light caught the water running off her flanks, Marcus could see that the real color was something deeper and more saturated than black, something that his brain was trying to categorize as a very dark, very vivid blue. Cobalt, maybe, the kind of blue that appeared almost purple in some lights and purely, intensely blue in others. He had a feeling that in daylight, in dry weather, the color of her would be striking enough to stop traffic. The water ran in rivers along the ridges of her wings. She had them folded tight against her body, not the relaxed fold of a creature at rest, but the tense, deliberate fold of something that was trying very hard to take up less space. The effort showed in the way the folded wing membranes trembled slightly, in the fine tension along the leading edges. It was the posture of someone sitting very still at a dinner table they had not been entirely sure they were welcome at, making themselves small out of a kind of anxious social consideration. She was young. He could tell that with the same instinct that told him the age of trees and the freshness of concrete. The horns above her brow hadn't fully grown in, they were there, emerging from the ridge above her eye line, but they were smooth-tipped and not yet full length, still in the process of becoming whatever they were going to be. Her proportions had that not quite settled quality of a body that was still negotiating with itself. She was going to be larger eventually. What she was right now was already impressive and still clearly not done. Her eyes were amber. Wide-set, large, with a quality of depth and luminescence that eyes that size tended to have. Not quite like looking at an animal's eyes, but not quite like looking at a human's eyes either. Something in between, or something outside both categories entirely. They were wide open in the way of someone trying to present themselves as clearly and honestly as possible, trying not to look threatening, trying to communicate legibility. They were rimmed in red, not the red of illness or injury, the red of someone who had been crying for a long time. The particular raw puffiness around the eye that came from sustained weeping, the kind that left a person hollowed out and exhausted and running on the fumes of whatever, had made them hold themselves together long enough to get to wherever they were trying to get. The rain made it impossible to tell right now whether there were still tears, but the evidence of what had come before the rain was written clearly enough in the swelling, in the careful, brittle steadiness of her expression. She held something in one enormous clawed hand, a piece of paper folded small, compressed against her palm. It had been soaked through so thoroughly that it had become nearly transparent, the ink bleeding through in soft shadows. She was holding it carefully despite this, the way people held things they couldn't afford to lose even after the thing had been damaged past the point of further protection mattering. They looked at each other for a moment. The rain came down between them, around them, relentless and indifferent. She started. She stopped. The word had come out with more air behind it than sound, like a sentence that had been rehearsed and then fell apart at the first syllable. She steadied herself. Her jaw moved once, the way jaws moved when people were swallowing down something that wanted to come up. The posting. Her voice was low. It had a roughness to it, a texture like gravel shifting, like the sound of large stones settling. But underneath the roughness there was a timbre that was almost musical, a resonance that came from a chest cavity considerably larger than a human's. On the board in town, it said Ironhold was hiring, labor work. She held up the paper slightly, the soaked job posting the evidence of her purpose here. I can lift things. The last 3 words landed with a kind of quiet precision that Marcus recognized from long experience. It was the precision of someone who had already anticipated every possible objection and had stripped their pitch down to the single most undeniable fact at their disposal. Not "I'm experienced" or "I'm reliable" or "I'll work hard," all of which were claims that required trust and time to verify. Just "I can lift things." Simple, demonstrable, inarguable, the bedrock claim of someone who knew that the other claims would have to wait, who was leading with the one thing that couldn't be questioned. Marcus looked at her for a long moment. He was not a man who rushed the process of observation. He looked at her face, at the wet misery barely contained in her posture, at the careful way she held the ruined posting, at the trembling tension of her folded wings, at the red rims of those wide amber eyes. Then he looked past her at the yard. Through the rain and the orange perimeter light, the site mud had become a slow-moving inland sea, sheets of standing water broken by the geometric islands of stacked materials, lumber bundles, pipe segments, the hulking shapes of the heavy equipment parked and sheeted for the weekend. The drainage was adequate for normal October rain. It was not adequate for this. Then he looked back at her. "You eaten today?" he asked. It wasn't the question she had been expecting. He watched it land, watched something shift behind her eyes, the slight recalibration of someone whose rehearsed defenses had been approached from an unexpected angle. Her jaw tightened. A muscle along the side of her neck moved. She pulled her gaze away from his for just a fraction of a second, the involuntary avoidance of someone who found the honest answer to a simple question somehow more exposing than anything else she had been prepared to face tonight. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Marcus had learned a very long time ago that there was a particular quality to the silence of people who hadn't eaten. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't the silence of great suffering most of the time. It was quieter than that and more ordinary, and in some ways harder to sit with because of how ordinary it was. It was the silence of someone who was dealing with a fact rather than an experience, who had moved past the acute discomfort into the flat, managed territory of this is simply the current condition of things. He had seen it in young guys showing up to first-day orientations who had clearly not had breakfast and probably not dinner the night before either, trying to look like that wasn't the case. He recognized it immediately and reliably. Her jaw tightened. That was answer enough. He held it for a beat. Then he stepped back from the door and held it open wider, pulling it all the way to the wall, giving the full width of the frame, which was not going to be enough for her shoulders but was going to be the best the door could offer. "Come in then," he said. His voice was the same as it had been, level, matter-of-fact, carrying no particular weight of charity or performance. The voice of a man who had made a practical decision and was implementing it. "Mind the ceiling fan." She looked at him. A longer look this time. He let her take it, let her run whatever assessment she needed to run, let her test the offer against whatever calculus she was working with. He understood the necessity of it. When someone offered something in the dark and the rain, you looked at them carefully before you walked through their door. That was just sense. Whatever she found in his face apparently cleared the threshold. She ducked, considerably, folding at the neck and the knees in a practiced, careful way that suggested she had been ducking through human-scale doorways long enough to have developed a technique, and came inside. The ceiling fan, mounted in the entryway and left on its lowest setting from the previous week's warmer days, grazed the top of her horn with a soft tick as she straightened cautiously in the hallway. She stopped immediately and looked up at it with the focused, slightly embarrassed attention of someone who had been warned about an obstacle and still managed to clip it anyway. "It's fine," Marcus said, reaching past her to click the fan off. The blades coasted to a stop. "It's seen worse." He led her through to the kitchen. The ceiling in there was higher. This had been part of why the foreman's house had been rebuilt 8 years ago, after a dwarvish site manager named Torvik had spent a year and a half visibly miserable in the standard height original structure. The new build had gone to 11 feet in the main rooms, which wasn't going to give Surith, though he didn't know her name yet, full standing room, but it was going to allow her to exist in the space without requiring the constant hunched compression of the doorway. She straightened by degrees as she came into the kitchen, like a person slowly releasing a breath they'd been holding. Not fully upright, the ceiling still required some accommodation, but closer to it. Something in her bearing changed with it, not much, but enough to see. Water was coming off her in a steady drip, pooling on the linoleum in the unhurried way of water that had achieved full saturation of its subject and was now simply moving on. Marcus pulled the chair from the far side of the table, the one he'd been sitting in, the one that wasn't against the wall, and set it aside, not offering it, just clearing space. He read the proportions of the situation without ceremony and pulled the two-person bench from against the wall instead, setting it in the open floor space where she would have room to settle without her tail sweeping anything off a surface. She watched him do this. She didn't say anything. He went to the stove. The stove was gas, which he preferred, and the pot from dinner was still sitting on the back burner with what he estimated was enough stew left to constitute a reasonable start. He turned on the burner under it without comment and went to the refrigerator. There were leftovers from Wednesday, a container of rice, half a roasted chicken that he'd been planning to use for lunches, the remains of a pot of beans he'd made on the weekend. He pulled all of it out and set it on the counter and began to assess the arithmetic of the situation. She was 8 feet of dragon who hadn't eaten today and had been, his estimate said, operating on short rations for longer than just today. The cold cup of coffee on the table was going to wait. The procurement invoices were going to wait. The rain was going to continue to be entirely unreasonable and was going to do that without his involvement. Behind him, slowly, carefully, Surith settled onto the bench. It creaked but held. He heard her exhale, a long, slow breath, barely audible, the sound of a creature that had been braced against something for a very long time and had just by small increments begun to unbrace. Marcus kept his back to her and let her have the privacy of it. He turned the burner up and began to double the stew. Outside, the rain came down on the iron-hold yard with the same relentless, impersonal force it had been bringing to bear all night. It came down on the lumber stacks and the equipment covers and the chain-link fence and the deep-churned mud of the site. It came down on the storage building on the east side of the property, dry inside, with its humming electrical panel and its dusty concrete floor and its space heater that Marcus had installed 2 winters ago during a cold snap and never bothered to remove. Inside the foreman's house, the stew heated on the stove. The radio played something low and unhurried between the songs. The ceiling fan was still. And Marcus Webb, who had seen everything the world could produce, stood at the stove and stirred and did not remark upon the fact that what had knocked on his door at midnight in the rain was a crying dragon. He thought about the posture she had arrived in. The careful, folded smallness of her. The way her voice had stripped itself down to the single most inarguable fact, I can lift things. The red rims of those amber eyes. The soaked job posting she'd carried as carefully as a document that mattered, long after the rain had made it past saving. He thought about the things those details, assembled together, described. He'd been reading people from their surfaces for 23 years. He was rarely wrong about what he read. He stirred the stew and said nothing and waited for her to be ready to talk. She would tell him, he suspected. When she was warm and had eaten something and had been in a dry room long enough for the sharp edge of whatever tonight had been to soften slightly into something she could narrate, rather than simply survive. People usually did, eventually, when you gave them a space where they didn't have to earn the right to exist in it first. That was all any of them ever needed, really. A door that opened and someone behind it who asked the right question. The stew began to steam. Marcus reached for 2 bowls, paused, looked at the size of the one in his hand, and went looking for the large stock pot instead. The table, her name was Surith. She told him this after she had been inside for perhaps 5 minutes, after the door was closed against the rain, and the ceiling fan was still, and she had settled, carefully, onto the bench he had pulled into the open floor space. Settled with the deliberate, weight-conscious precision of a creature that had spent a great deal of time in spaces built for smaller beings, and had developed a practiced awareness of what her body did to the furniture it trusted itself to. The bench held. She seemed mildly surprised by this, and then seemed mildly embarrassed by her own surprise, which told Marcus something about the quality of the furniture she had been dealing with recently. Surith, he repeated, the way he repeated names when he first heard them, not to confirm but to commit. Names mattered. He had always believed this with the particular conviction of a man who managed large groups of people and understood that getting someone's name right, immediately and reliably, was one of the most fundamental signals you could send about how you intended to treat them. She looked at him when he said it back to her. A brief, direct look, quickly moderated, like something had been checked off a list she hadn't been fully conscious of keeping. He went back to the stove. The stew was a venison and root vegetable situation that he'd made in quantity on Wednesday and had been working through since. He had a policy, loosely held but consistently practiced, of always cooking more than he needed. It was a habit that had developed over years of being the person others came to when things went sideways, and it had never once been the wrong policy. He stirred the pot and assessed what he was working with and went to the refrigerator without ceremony to address the gap between what was there and what was needed. The cold chicken came off the bone efficiently. The rice went into the pot. He had a half-dozen eggs, and he cracked 4 of them into a separate pan with butter because protein was protein, and the arithmetic of the situation had been clear to him since he opened the door. He worked quietly and without the performative bustle of someone trying to demonstrate their hospitality. He simply cooked the way he always cooked, which was with a direct, practical attention to the task. And he let the kitchen be what kitchens were at their best, a room where the smell of food heating up did some of the talking so the people in it didn't have to. The radio murmured. The rain came down on the roof with the relentless, impersonal force of a weather system that had its own business to attend to and was attending to it. The stew began to steam. Behind him, he heard Surith exhale slowly. He heard the bench creak once as she resettled her weight. Then he heard her begin to talk. She told him what she was willing to tell him, and he listened the way he listened to everything, with his full attention, without interruption, without the restless forward lean of someone waiting for their turn to speak. He had learned early in his career that most people, when they were trying to tell you something important, were also simultaneously trying to figure out how much of the important thing they could afford to tell you, and that the best thing you could do for that process was to make the silence around it as non-pressuring as possible. She had come from the Northern Ranges. He knew the Northern Ranges by reputation, a broad swath of mountainous territory that ran along the upper edge of the mapped world and then continued, by most accounts, considerably past the point where the maps became reliable. Cold country, old country, the kind of terrain that didn't invite casual habitation and had consequently been, for a very long time, the territory of species who didn't require invitation from the landscape. Her clutch had been small, she said. 3 others, besides herself, which Marcus understood from context to be on the modest end of the scale. Her flight, she used the word with the particular matter-of-fact weight of someone referring to a category of relationship that didn't have an easy equivalent in other vocabularies. And Marcus, who had been in the business long enough to have encountered the concept before, understood it as roughly analogous to an extended family with the structural coherence of a small community. Her flight had contracted with a mining consortium approximately 2 seasons ago. He didn't ask the name of the consortium. He had been in construction long enough to know the shape of the story before she got there. Mining consortiums that recruited from the Northern Ranges for heavy labor were a category of employer about which he had professional opinions, and those opinions were largely unfavorable, and he kept them to himself for the moment because this wasn't about his opinions. The consortium had folded. This was delivered with the flat declarative brevity of a fact that had been stated so many times, internally and perhaps to others, that all the acute edges had been worn off it by repetition. The consortium had folded, and the contracts had dissolved with it, and the flight had scattered in the way that groups scattered when the structure holding them in place was abruptly removed. Not dramatically, not in anger, but with the pragmatic dispersal of people responding individually to a shared crisis that no longer had a collective solution. Some had gone further north, some had gone east. Surith said this with a quietness that was not entirely the quietness of someone who had made peace with those departures. He heard what was underneath it. He didn't remark on it. She had gone the only direction she had a contact for. A cousin's name written on a piece of paper with a location, a town about 40 miles south and east from where she was sitting now. She had arrived at the location and the cousin had not been there. Not recently gone, from what she could determine. No one in the town had been able to confirm when the cousin had last been present. The paper with the name on it was, by the time she had arrived and asked and waited and asked again, a piece of information that had been accurate at some point in the past and was no longer. She had then been sleeping in the equipment barn on the edge of that same town for 6 days. The barn's owner had found her on the morning of the 7th day and asked her to leave. She said this quickly and added, without being asked, that he had not been unkind about it, just firm. She seemed to want Marcus to have the complete picture on this point, including the not unkind part, as if the man's basic decency in an uncomfortable situation was a piece of information she was committed to representing accurately even though it didn't change the outcome. Marcus filed this. The small, careful fairness of it told him more about her than the rest of the story combined. She had found the job posting 3 days after the barn. The board in town, a physical board, the kind that still existed in working towns where people still put actual paper up for practical reasons, had the iron hold notice on it, and she had memorized the address and walked the distance through 2 days of weather that had apparently been building toward tonight's performance, and she had arrived here, and she had knocked. She told all of it in the flat, measured tone of someone who had made peace with the facts, who had processed the sequence of events past the point of active grief into the territory of narrative. This happened, and then this, and then this, and who was delivering the narrative with the clinical precision of someone filing a report on events that had happened to a person they were still, in some important ways, in the process of deciding how to feel about being. But her hands resting on the table gripped each other too tightly. He saw it in his peripheral awareness while he finished at the stove. The interlaced fingers, the whitened knuckles, the sustained clenching that was doing the work that the voice wasn't doing. The voice was flat and measured and making peace. The hands were doing something entirely different. The hands were holding on to something that the voice had agreed to set down for the purposes of the telling. He had been reading people long enough to know what that meant. He knew it the way he knew the signs of a wall that was holding more load than it was rated for, not in imminent danger, nothing that required urgent intervention, but carrying something that wanted to be distributed differently, that would eventually need to be distributed differently, and that was being managed in the meantime by the constant, invisible effort of holding. He brought the bowls to the table. One of his own bowls, a standard cereal-sized affair that had been adequate for one person eating dinner. One of the large stock pot lids he had cleaned and repurposed as a serving vessel, piled high, which was not elegant but was practical and was what the situation called for. He set the larger one in front of her without commentary, the way he had made all the other decisions in the last hour, as if they were simply the obvious next action, as if they required no special acknowledgement. She looked at the food, then she looked at him, then she looked back at the food. She ate carefully, not ravenously. There was a deliberate moderation in how she paced herself that was recognizable as the behavior of someone who had learned, through recent and direct experience, that the amount of food in front of you now was not a reliable predictor of the amount of food that would be in front of you later, and that it was accordingly wise to eat with some restraint, to not trust the abundance, to leave room for the possibility that this was a limited event rather than a new condition. It was the eating of someone rationing something they weren't sure would be offered again. Marcus recognized it. He had seen it before, on job sites and off them, in the particular quality of attention people gave to free food when free food was not a thing they had reliable access to. He ate his own bowl at a steady, unhurried pace and said nothing about it. And when he could see that her serving was running low, he got up and refilled it from the pot on the stove without asking. And when she looked up at the sound of him getting up, he just said there's more, matter-of-factly, and set the refill in front of her and sat back down. The hands on the table, he noticed, had loosened slightly. The posting's real, he said, when the eating had reached the stage where talking was a natural accompaniment rather than an interruption. He said it first because it seemed like the thing she most needed to have confirmed, the weight she had been carrying 40 miles through building, whether on a piece of paper she had found on a board in town. I need bodies who can move prefabricated wall panels and foundation forms. The work is physical, the hours are long. He paused and looked at her directly, because the next part needed to land clearly. I run a dry site, no drinking on the grounds, no exceptions. That applies to everyone on the crew without modification, and it will apply to you the same way. He said this not because he had particular reason to think it would be an issue, but because he said it to everyone, because the rule meant nothing if it was applied selectively, and because stating it plainly up front was the respectful thing. It assumed she was a person who could hear a workplace standard and comply with it, rather than a person who needed special handling. Pay is the same as anyone else on the crew. I don't discount for species. He watched the last sentence land. He watched her absorb it. She held very still for a moment, and he could see the recalibration happening, the adjustment of whatever internal model she had brought to this conversation to accommodate a data point that didn't fit the shape of what she had been expecting. She looked at him with an expression he had seen before. He had seen it on the faces of young men who had shown up to his sites with calloused hands and empty wallets, and the kind of resume that was mostly gaps and manual labor and nothing that looked good on paper, who had come and braced for negotiation from a position of weakness, who had their arguments already lined up and their concessions already mentally prepared. It was the look of someone who had done the math on what they were worth in the current market and had calculated a number that was lower than the real number and had accepted that lower number as the price of the current situation and was now being told, unexpectedly, that the current situation had different prices than advertised. It was the look of someone who had prepared to negotiate from weakness and had not yet understood that they weren't going to have to. "I'm a hard worker," Sarith said. Her voice was steady. There was something in the set of her jaw that suggested the next sentence had been prepared well in advance and was being delivered from a place of significant personal resolution. "I don't complain." "I'm not worried about that." Marcus folded his hands on the table. He meant it. He had taken one look at her on the doorstep and made his assessment, and his assessment did not include concerns about work ethic. He had been doing this long enough that he trusted his reading of people on this particular question, and what he had read at the door was not someone who complained. "What I'm going to need from you is straightforward. Show up on time, do what you're asked, tell me directly if something isn't working. That's the whole job." He let that sit for a moment, then he continued. "I've got a storage building on the east side of the property. It's dry, it's got power, and there's a space heater in there that'll run off the site grid." He said this in the same tone he had been using for everything level, factual, carrying no particular weight of generosity or charity or performance, just the statement of what was available. "It's not much." Something moved across Sarith's face. It started with her mouth, a slight parting, a breath drawn in for a sentence, and he could already see the shape of what the sentence was going to be. He had heard versions of it many times. "It's more than or I couldn't possibly, or most common and most telling, I don't want to be any trouble." The reflexive diminishment of someone who had learned to make themselves small in the asking, who translated their needs downward before stating them as a form of preemptive apology for having needs at all. "It's temporary," he said before she got there. The word landed like a door gently but firmly closing, not on her, on the diminishment. He cut it off not because he didn't want to hear it, but because he didn't want her to have to say it. He knew from long experience that making people articulate their own smallness, even when they were reaching for it themselves, was a kind of harm that looked like nothing from the outside and left marks anyway. "Until you're on your feet and have a few paychecks to work with, that's all." He said it matter-of-factly. He said it with the breezy authority of someone stating an established policy, something that had been true before tonight and would be true after tonight, something that required no special acknowledgement because it was simply the way things were done here. As if he had not, in fact, just decided this in the last 5 minutes. As if the East Storage Building had always been available for this precise purpose and Sarith's arrival had simply activated it, the way a code activates a mechanism that was always ready to run. "I'll have Denise in the office set you up with paperwork in the morning." The kitchen was quiet for a moment, except for the rain on the roof and the low radio and the hum of the refrigerator doing its refrigerator business in the corner. Marcus watched Sarith and did not make it look like he was watching her. She stared at him, the amber eyes still carrying their red rims, their evidence of the long and private night that had preceded this one, were doing something complicated. Something that he recognized as the internal processing of a person who has been handed an outcome that doesn't match any of the scenarios they had prepared for and is now working in real time to understand the shape of what has just happened to them. Not suspicious, she wasn't looking for the catch. She was looking for the framework. The category this fell into, the thing it resembled that she already had a map for. He could have told her there was no category, that some things were just what they appeared to be, but she would find that out for herself over time, and people tended to trust what they discovered over what they were told. The silence stretched to a length that a different kind of man might have found uncomfortable. Marcus was not that kind of man. He had sat in enough difficult silences to understand that they were often doing important work, and that the impulse to fill them was usually more about the person who felt the impulse than about what the silence actually needed. "Why?" Sarith asked. It was quiet, almost inaudible under the rain. But it was direct and it was serious, and it was the question underneath all the other questions, the one that wanted to know not just what was happening but what it meant, what it was built on, whether it had a foundation or whether it was the kind of thing that looked solid until you needed it to be. Marcus picked up his coffee cup, looked at it, remembered that it was cold, had been cold for 2 hours, was not going to be anything other than cold at this point. He set it back down. He thought about what to say. Not for long. The answer was not complicated, but he wanted to say it right, which meant saying it in the way that was actually true rather than the way that would sound best. There were 100 things he could have said. He could have said something about the job posting being genuine and her being clearly capable. He could have said something about the site needing strong backs and she having one. He could have said something that made it about labor economics rather than what it was actually about, which would have been easier for both of them but would also have been, in some small and important way, a lie. He could have said something about his own history, about the foreman who had given him a break at 19 that he'd spent 23 years paying forward. But that would have made this about him, and it wasn't about him. "Because it's raining," he said, "and you knocked." He watched her receive it. He watched her take it in the way she had taken in everything else tonight, carefully, completely, without performance. He watched something in the set of her shoulders change, not dramatically. Not the melodramatic release of a creature at the end of a story, the shoulder drop and the exhale and the transformation scene. Something quieter than that, something structural. Like a load-bearing element that had been under sustained stress suddenly receiving, not relief from the stress, but a second point of support, not fixing the problem yet, but changing the geometry of it, making it something that could be managed rather than something that had to be endured alone. Her hands on the table slowly unclenched. She didn't say anything immediately. He didn't need her to. The answer to why wasn't a thing that required a response because it wasn't an offer she needed to accept or negotiate or be grateful for in any formal way. It was just the truth of the situation stated plainly. It was raining. She had knocked. He had opened the door. These things had happened in sequence, and the sequence had a logic that didn't require any additional architecture. After a while she said, "I'll be there on time every day." Not "thank you," not "I won't forget this." Not any of the social formulas that would have acknowledged the weight of the moment and placed it in the category of debt. Just, "I'll be there on time, every day." A commitment stated as a fact in the same flat declarative register she'd used for the story of the consortium and the cousin and the barn. The register of someone who dealt in what was reliable rather than what was felt. 6:30, Marcus said, "Morning briefing, don't be late." "I won't be." He believed her. He believed her the way he believed the measurements his best crew members called out, not because he had evidence, not yet, but because he had been listening to people for 23 years and he had developed a very accurate ear for the quality of a commitment, for the difference between words that were meant and words that were covering for the absence of meaning. She meant it. She was going to mean it every morning for as long as she was on this site, and he knew that as clearly as he knew anything. He got up from the table and brought the pot from the stove and put it in front of her. "Finish it," he said, "there's no point saving it." He washed his own bowl in the sink and got his jacket from the hook in the hall and his keys from the counter. He had a few things to check in the yard before he could reasonably sleep. The rain was doing things to the drainage situation that he wanted to confirm were within acceptable parameters. He pulled on his jacket. "The storage building's unlocked," he said. "East side corrugated green door, you'll see it from the yard. Space heaters on the back wall, switch on the cord." He paused at the hallway entrance. "Sleep well." He didn't wait for a response. He went out through the back into the rain, which had not relented at all and showed no particular intention of doing so, and he walked the perimeter of the site with a flashlight in a steady, unhurried way, checking the drainage channels, assessing the material covers, doing the work that the weather made necessary. Behind him, in the kitchen, a dragon finished the last of a pot of stew and sat for a long moment in the quiet warmth of a room that had asked nothing of her except to come in out of the rain. The radio played something low between the songs. The rain came down. And in the east side of the Ironhold construction yard, a space heater hummed in a storage building with a corrugated green door, waiting, the way dry spaces waited, with the patient and impersonal warmth of a thing that had been built for exactly this kind of night. A cold, tearful dragon knocked at midnight, part 3. What the crew learned. The crew had questions. Of course they did. This was not surprising. Marcus had anticipated questions the way he anticipated rain delays and material backorders. Not with dread, but with the calm, practical foreknowledge of a man who had been in the business long enough to understand that the world produced friction as reliably as it produced anything else, and that the job was to manage it rather than to be surprised by it. What he had not entirely anticipated was the specific texture of the questions or the speed at which they arrived. The morning crew came in at 6:30. By 6:34, Benicio from framing had already seen Surith crossing the yard toward the main briefing area. A blue dragon, 8 feet of her, moving through the early October morning mist with the careful, deliberate gait of someone who was very conscious of where they were putting their feet, and had said, loudly enough for most of the assembled crew to hear, that the new hire appeared to have been crying. This was accurate. Surith's eyes were still puffy, still carrying the raw, waterlogged look of sustained weeping that a single night's sleep in a dry storage building, however welcome, had not been sufficient to fully erase. She had clearly made some effort. Her scales were dry. She had smoothed the ruffled edges of her wing membranes with the focused attention of someone making themselves presentable. She was carrying herself with the upright, forward-facing deliberateness of a person who has decided that they are going to walk into a difficult situation without flinching. None of that changed what the eyes said to anyone who looked directly at them. Benicio, to be entirely fair to him, was not a malicious man. He was a good framer, a reliable crew member, and possessed of a blunt, percussive personality that served him well in some contexts and less well in others. He had the social awareness of a dropped hammer. This was a phrase Marcus had actually used in those exact words to Denise in the office approximately 8 months ago when describing an incident involving Benicio and a new hire's lunch, and he found that it had become, in his own interior vocabulary, simply the most efficient descriptor available. Marcus gave him a look. It was not an elaborate look. It did not involve raised eyebrows or any particular sharpening of expression. It was, in fact, a remarkably economical look, the look of a man who had been communicating precise and unmistakable meaning to crew members through eye contact alone for 2 decades, and had refined the practice to its essential minimum. It said, without any ambiguity at all, "That's enough of that." Benicio received the look, processed it with the efficient self-preservation instinct that was, arguably, his most reliable quality, and discovered that he had something very important to attend to on the far side of the yard. The rest of the morning briefing proceeded. The questions came throughout the day, in the way that questions on a job site always came, sideways, between tasks, in the natural pauses that opened up when 2 people were standing next to the same thing waiting for the same thing to happen. Nobody scheduled a formal inquiry. Nobody arranged a meeting. Questions on a construction site were a geological process, accumulating in layers through the course of a working day. Priya, who ran the electrical rough in crew and had been with Ironhold for 4 years, asked Marcus during the morning coffee break whether the new hire was going to be permanent or seasonal. It was a practical question, asked in the practical tone of someone who was already thinking about crew dynamics and workflow integration rather than about novelty. Marcus said he didn't know yet. Priya nodded as if this were a complete answer, which, coming from Marcus, it more or less was. Old Domnico, who was 67 years old and had been doing masonry work since before Marcus was born, and communicated primarily through a series of grunts and nods that his longtime co-workers had developed a near-fluent interpretive competency in, watched Surith lift a stack of prefab wall panels off the delivery truck at mid-morning without any particular expression on his face. He watched her set them down with precise, careful placement in the staging area. He watched her check the alignment, make a small adjustment, and move to the next stack. Then he made a sound, a single short, upward-inflected syllable, which Priya later translated, for the benefit of a newer crew member who asked, as roughly equivalent to, "She knows what she's doing." Coming from Domnico, this was an endorsement comparable to a standing ovation from anyone else. The questions that carried more friction came from 2 of the mid-crew guys, Tomas and a newer hire named Garrett, who had been on site for about 3 months and had not yet developed the seasoned pragmatism that longer tenure tended to produce. Their questions were not, exactly, hostile. They were the questions of people who had worked alongside non-humans in a general sense, who would not have described themselves as prejudiced, and who would have been genuinely offended by the suggestion, but who had also never shared a job site with something that could, as Garrett put it to Tomas in a conversation they were not aware Marcus was close enough to overhear, accidentally step on you. This was not an entirely unreasonable concern, Marcus acknowledged privately. It was the wrong framing, but the underlying logistics question was legitimate. He addressed it that afternoon, directly, without making a production of it. He called a brief 5-minute all-hands at the end of the lunch break, which he occasionally did for site safety updates, and which nobody found unusual. And he covered the practical accommodation items with the same brisk, factual tone he used for everything else. Surith would be working primarily in the materials staging and heavy lifting operations. The footpath markings along the east side of the foundation were being adjusted to account for the increased activity in that zone. He pointed to where Lewis from the safety crew had spent the morning repainting lines. The standard tail clearance buffer, he said this without any particular inflection, as if tail clearance buffer were an entirely routine phrase in the site safety lexicon, which it now was 3 feet, same as the equipment clearance buffer, marked in the same yellow. He expected everyone to treat it accordingly. That was it. That was the meeting. He dismissed them back to work. He noticed, as the crew dispersed, that Surth had been standing at the edge of the briefing group and had not looked at him once during the entire address. She had been looking at a fixed point somewhere in the middle distance, holding very still, with the expression of someone who was managing something carefully. He didn't say anything about it. He went back to his own work. By the end of the first week, the questions had mostly settled into answers by the simple mechanism of observation overriding speculation. What the crew had learned was this: Surth could carry 4 prefab wall panels at once, in a stable stack, across uneven ground, while simultaneously navigating around the obstacles of an active construction site, and set them down with an accuracy that the crew's best estimate put at within 1/8 of an inch of wherever she had been told to put them. 2 humans, working together with the standard panel dolly on flat ground, could manage one. The math was not complicated. By the end of Monday, the materials staging operation had been reorganized around her capacity, not because Marcus directed this explicitly, but because the crew were practical people and practical people adjusted to available resources. She had an eye for level that was, frankly, unsettling to the people who prided themselves on theirs. Old Domnico had an eye for level that had become something close to legend on the site. He could look at a course of block from 15 feet away and tell you which one was sitting 3/16 high, and he was right often enough that people had stopped verifying and started just moving the block. Surth, on her second day, looked at a concrete form that had been laser leveled that morning, tilted her head approximately 2 degrees, and said quietly that the south end was sitting a little high. The form was sitting 4 millimeters high at the south end. The laser level had drifted. Domnico, who had been standing nearby, looked at the form, looked at Surth, made a sound that was, by general consensus, the closest thing to impress that anyone had heard from him in recent memory, and went back to his work without further comment. After that, he began, by small and apparently unconscious degrees, to position himself in proximity to wherever Surth was working, in the way of a craftsman who has identified another craftsman and wants to be near that quality of attention without necessarily making a statement about it. She never asked for breaks she hadn't earned. This sounds like a simple thing. On a construction site, it is not a simple thing. The rhythm of breaks, when you take them, whether you take them, what you do with them, is a significant component of the social fabric of a working crew. People who don't participate in the break rhythm are held at a slight distance, not hostilely but structurally, the way people who eat at different times than everyone else are slightly outside the primary bonding mechanism of a shared meal. Surth participated in the break rhythm precisely, neither exceeding it nor withdrawing from it, and this was the part that Marcus noted particularly. On 2 occasions during that first week, she gave a break back. Came to him, matter-of-factly, and said she was good to keep going if there was work to do. He had told her both times to take the break anyway, and she had, without argument, but she had offered. She had started, tentatively and by gradual degrees, to eat lunch with Priya and old Domnico. This had begun not by design, but by geography. The first day, Surth had settled in the only space on the site where she comfortably fit, which happened to be the open area near the materials staging zone, which happened to be where Priya and Domnico had been eating their lunches for approximately 4 years by established and unspoken convention. Priya had looked up, assessed the situation, and moved her cooler 3 feet to make room without being asked. Domnico had not moved at all, which was his standard response to most things, and which in this context functioned as an invitation. They ate in silence, mostly. Priya and Domnico were not, between them, what anyone would describe as conversational lunch companions. They had a combined daily word output, during work hours, that Marcus estimated somewhere around 30, and most of those were task-related. But they were comfortable with silence in the way of people who had been in each other's company long enough that silence had become a form of communication rather than an absence of it. Surth, it turned out, was also comfortable with silence. By Wednesday, she was bringing her own lunch, a quantity of food that had clearly required some preparation and that she carried in a container of industrial scale. By Thursday, Domnico had started arriving at the lunch spot slightly earlier and had, on 2 occasions, left a piece of his wife's homemade bread at the edge of her designated space without comment or ceremony, in the manner of a man leaving an offering at a shrine, and had returned to his own meal before she arrived. On Thursday afternoon, Surith had found the bread, looked at it, looked at Domnico, and said nothing. But she ate it with a care and deliberateness that communicated the kind of gratitude that is too large to be handled by words without losing something in the translation. What the crew had also learned, and this was the thing nobody said plainly, because saying it plainly would have made it self-conscious, which would have made it smaller, was that she smiled now. Not broadly, not frequently, not in the wide social way of someone performing positivity. It appeared sideways and surprised, as if it hadn't expected to be called on, as if it were the involuntary product of something that had caught her off guard, some small thing that had turned out to be good when she hadn't been expecting good things, and her face had simply responded before her management of her face had caught up. It was the smile of someone who had been carrying careful expectations for a while and kept finding them exceeded by small margins, and who had not yet recalibrated those expectations upward because the habit of caution was slower to change than the reality that produced it. Marcus noticed. He noticed the way a foreman noticed things, not by staring, not by directing his attention explicitly at the thing he was tracking, but by the steady accumulation of peripheral detail that came from spending most of your working day in motion through a space, with your attention broadly distributed, so that everything within your range was in some sense always slightly in your awareness. He had developed this kind of distributed noticing over years of site management, and it had become, like the eye for structural problems and the instinct for crew dynamics, simply part of how he processed the world. He noticed Domnico's bread offering. He noticed the way Priya, on Friday afternoon, showed Surith something on her phone that made Surith tilt her enormous head at the screen with an expression of focused curiosity that shifted, as Priya apparently explained whatever she was explaining, into something that was clearly appreciation for an absurdity. A dragon and a human standing next to a partially framed wall, sharing a laugh about something small and private and entirely theirs. He noticed Garrett, who had been among the friction carriers at the start of the week, asking Surith on Thursday to spot for him while he worked at height on the scaffolding. Not because Surith was formally designated as a spotter, but because Garrett had apparently concluded, through the accumulation of a week's observation, that if something went wrong up there, he would rather have Surith below him than not. Surith had positioned herself without comment and watched the scaffolding with focused, unwavering attention for the full duration of the task. He noticed, in the way he noticed everything, what was being built. Not the structure, though that was going up clean and on schedule, which was its own satisfaction. Something else. Something that didn't appear on any site plan, but that any experienced foreman knew to watch for, because it was the difference between a crew that functioned and a crew that worked, between people who shared a job site and people who shared a purpose. On a Friday afternoon, 3 weeks after that first midnight knock, Marcus finished his end-of-week walkthrough of the site with 20 minutes to spare before he needed to leave. He did what he sometimes did with 20 spare minutes at the end of a week, walked the perimeter, not checking anything specifically, just being present in the space he was responsible for. Feeling the weight and the quality of the week in the air of the site the way a musician might listen back through a recording. He ended up at the East Storage Building. The door was slightly open. Through the gap, he could hear the familiar hum of the space heater that he'd installed during the cold snap 2 winters ago and never removed. He had not gone inside since the first night, when he'd done a quick check of the electrical to make sure everything was running correctly. He stopped at the door and looked through the gap without pushing it wider. The space had been organized with a spare, careful practicality that told you something about its occupant. Her tools were staged by the door, lined up with a precision that went slightly beyond mere neatness, the precision of someone for whom the order of their equipment was not just convenience, but a form of control over a small piece of the world. The folded tarp that served as her sleeping area was as flat and arranged as a tarp was capable of being, which was not very, but she had clearly made the effort. The space heater glowed in the corner. The electrical panel hummed. On the wall, at a height that was clearly calibrated to be at eye level for someone of Surith's stature rather than a human's, which put it significantly higher than any wall decoration in any human-occupied space Marcus had ever seen, a piece of paper had been carefully taped. It was a child's drawing. He could see it clearly enough through the gap to read its intentions if not its details. A dragon, rendered in crayon with the enthusiastic anatomical inaccuracy of a young child who had a very strong feeling about what a dragon should look like, and had not allowed any particular knowledge of dragon anatomy to constrain the expression of that feeling. The wings were extraordinary, large, dramatically spiky, bearing approximately no relationship to the actual structure of Surith's wings, and colored in a purple and green combination that no actual dragon sported. The overall impression was of a creature that was absolutely, triumphantly itself, regardless of what real dragons looked like. Domnico's granddaughter had visited the site that Wednesday. She was 6 years old, possessed of her grandfather's economy of expression in inverse form. She had approximately 1,000 words for every situation and deployed them all without pause. And she had seen Surith from across the yard and had produced, from somewhere in the vicinity of her sternum, a sound of pure, undiluted joy that Marcus was fairly sure they had heard on the next job site over. She had spent the better part of the lunch break sitting near Surith and drawing, with focused artistic intensity, the drawing that was now taped to the storage building wall. She had presented it with a solemnity that suggested she understood it to be a significant work. Surith had accepted it with both hands. Marcus had not been close enough to see her face in that moment. He had been on the other side of the site. But Priya had been nearby, and Priya had mentioned it to him afterward briefly in the passing way of someone sharing information they felt was relevant without making a thing of it. She looked like someone had given her something she didn't know she needed. He stood at the door for another moment, looking at the drawing on the wall, at the tools staged by the door, at the small, careful life that was being assembled in this space, practically and without drama, 1 week at a time. He went to his truck. He got a notepad from the glove compartment, the small spiral-bound one he used for site notes, and he tore out a page and wrote on it, leaning on the hood of the truck in the last of the Friday afternoon light. He wrote slowly and clearly because what he wrote needed to be unambiguous. He went back to the storage building. Her work gloves were on the shelf inside the door. He folded the note and set it on top of them where she would find it first thing on Monday morning. He drove home. He was still in his driveway on Saturday morning, not yet out of the truck, when he saw the note on the windshield. It was held in place by a small piece of scale, blue, the particular deep cobalt blue that Surith's scales showed in daylight, catching the morning light like a piece of polished stone. She had clearly lost it naturally, the way scales shed, and had picked it up and carried it and used it for this. He looked at it for a moment before he looked at the note. It was smooth and curved on one side and flat on the other, and it held the light like something that had been made to do exactly that. He peeled the note off the windshield and unfolded it. The handwriting was large. It was careful. Each letter had been formed with deliberate intention, the way people wrote when they were writing something that mattered to them and wanted the writing itself to reflect that. It said, "Yes, thank you, I will not let you down." Marcus read it once. Then he read it again, the way he read things that deserved 2 readings. He looked at the piece of blue scale resting in his palm. He closed his fingers around it. He tucked the note into his jacket pocket against his chest, where he kept the things that needed keeping. He sat in the truck for another moment in the Saturday morning quiet of his driveway. Then he got out, went inside, made coffee, and thought about the week ahead. He had known a lot of people in his 23 years on the job. Humans who had come in with impeccable references and crumbled under the first real pressure the site put on them, not from any failure of skill, but from some insufficiency of the thing underneath skill, the part that had to hold when the conditions stopped being theoretical. Trolls who had arrived with no references at all and become, within months, the structural center of the crew. The people everyone else oriented toward when things got difficult, because they were steady in a way that was simply, bedrock, reliably true. Dwarves who turned out to be thieves, petty and systematic, and who had made him doubt his own reading of people for the better part of a year afterward. Goblins who turned out to be the most precise, methodical, gifted welders he had ever had the privilege of watching work, who took a pride in their craft that was almost architectural in its structure. He had learned, not in any single moment but through the gradual accumulation of 23 years of watching people meet the world and be met by it, that the things that were easy to see were almost never the things that determined outcomes. The references, the prior experience, the certifications, the presentation in the first interview. These things told you something. They did not tell you the thing that mattered most, which was what a person did when the conditions were against them and they had run out of the easier options, and what was left was only themselves and whatever they were made of. For that, you needed different data, and the data came in different forms. He had learned to read the midnight knocks. Not literally, this was the first time that phrase had applied literally, and he was aware of the particular quality of the coincidence, but in the broader sense. The people who showed up when things were difficult and held themselves together enough to ask. Who stripped their pitch down to the irreducible fact of what they could offer, because the harder facts were not up for negotiation. Who carried their soaked and ruined evidence carefully because it was all the evidence they had, and they were not going to surrender it just because the rain had gotten to it. Those people, in his experience, not always, but almost always, with a consistency that had long since crossed from anecdote into something he was willing to bet on, turned out to be the ones worth having. Not because suffering made people good. It did not reliably make people good. But because there was a particular quality that the experience of running down to your last resources and still showing up tended to select for, and that quality was the thing underneath skill that had to hold when the conditions stopped being theoretical. Surith had knocked at midnight in the rain with nothing but a soaked job posting and 3 words, "I can lift things." She had come inside. She had eaten. She had slept on a folded tarp in a storage building and gotten up in the morning and shown up to a crew of strangers who had questions she could not yet answer with anything but performance. And she had performed without complaint or drama. And she had done it every day for 3 weeks while something in her, slowly and sideways and surprised, had begun to come back to life. He had known she was worth betting on. He had known it at the door. Surith had been no exception to the pattern he'd built his judgment on. She never was going to be. He put his coffee cup in the dishwasher, picked up his site keys from the hook by the door, and went to go open the yard. There was work to do. There was always work to do. And now he had a crew that was better at it than it had been 4 weeks ago, better in the ways that showed on the job plan, and better in the ways that only showed up later when the hard weeks came in the quality of how they held. The scale was still in his jacket pocket. He left it there.